Hey there, my name is James Lee. Welcome to my channel 5149, where I talk business, politics, society, and today we're going to talk about the media's coverage of Israel and Palestine.
Now to the rest of the day's news, and the veteran Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh from the broadcaster Al Jazeera has been shot dead while covering an Israeli army raid in the occupied West Bank. She died as the raid took place on the Jenin refugee camp. Her employer, Al Jazeera, said she was shot in the face by Israeli soldiers and was wearing a flak jacket marked press. Israel denies targeting journalists and says the Palestinians have rejected their offer of a joint investigation.
Horrific stuff. Now, I know that the ongoing violence between Israel and Palestine is obviously a very tough subject. It's a very contentious subject, also one that takes place far away from most of us, so it's kind of easy just to ignore it. But I think it's important to address the subtle but deliberate ways in which legacy media misleads its viewers about Israeli-Palestinian violence, so much so that you might not even notice that they're doing it. MSNBC: Israeli police clash with mourners at a funeral procession for journalist. The Wall Street Journal: Israeli forces Palestinians clash in the West Bank before funeral of journalist. Fox News: Israeli police clash with mourners carrying casket of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. It's interesting that the word clash is used so often because the word clash kind of lends itself to a certain neutrality, an interpretation that there's a conflict between two equal groups in which violent acts are perpetrated by both sides. Now contrast that with this headline from The Intercept: Israel admits it might have killed journalists. Attacks her funeral. Israeli police assaulted mourners carrying the casket of Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American reporter, the same day Israel's army admitted it might have killed her. Or another headline, this one from Amnesty International: Increase in unlawful killings and other crimes highlights urgent need to end Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. Such a different sounding narrative, right? Using words like assault, killing, apartheid definitely conveys a clear indictment of who instigated the violence, while also strongly alluding to the sort of power imbalance between a heavily armed Israeli police force and what appeared to be unarmed Palestinian civilians and journalists. Now, the question is this deliberate? Is there a fundamental systemic difference between mainstream coverage and independent coverage of Israel and Palestine? What is the actual truth? Is there a clash between two equal groups, or is there a clear aggressor and victim? Are the mainstream media outlets purposefully misleading their audience when it comes to violence committed against Palestinians? A lot of questions I just rattled off, but based on a 2021 study from MIT of 50 years of New York Times coverage of the conflict, found a, quote, disproportionate use of the passive voice to refer to negative or violent action perpetrated towards Palestinians. Using the passive voice, for example, reporting that, quote, Palestinians were killed in clashes rather than Israeli forces killed Palestinians, is language that helps shield Israel from scrutiny. It also obscures the reason so many Palestinians would be angry at Israel. Also, a 2019 analysis by data researchers in Canada of more than 100,000 headlines from 50 years of U.S. coverage across 5 newspapers concluded that the U.S. mainstream media coverage of the conflict favors Israel in terms of both the sheer quantity of stories covered and by providing more opportunities to the Israelis to amplify their point of view. That 2019 study also found that the words associated with violence, including clash and clashes, were more likely to be used in stories about Palestinians than Israelis. Okay, so we've established that this isn't a one-off kind of thing and that there appears to be a repeated pattern of biased media coverage. But I feel like at this point, in order to round out our discussion, we need a little bit more context, although I don't know if I can possibly do justice in this video, the history of Israel and Palestine and the territorial disputes in that region over the last 100 somewhat years, but I do want to briefly touch on the special relationship between Israel and the US and why the mainstream American media outlets have been so friendly in their coverage of Israel. Quote, US and Israeli interests have converged in important ways. The United States has served as a critical sponsor for Israel financially and politically, and Israel has played an invaluable role in helping the United States dominate the Middle East. I don't mean to continue to beat a dead horse here, but if you really want to get to the bottom of something, understand what is going on, you gotta follow the money, because the unfortunate truth is that everything in our society is driven by capital. The US sponsors Israel's economic and military ambitions, and then in return, Israel functions as a kind of an outpost for US imperialism into the lucrative, oil-rich Middle East region. And the media plays an important role in this ecosystem. Greg Shupak, a media studies professor at the University of Guelph in Toronto, who has written extensively about this subject, explains, quote, when coverage of Palestine-Israel is viewed in the context of commercial media, it is no surprise that narratives about the issue that are favorable to Israel are as prevalent as they are. The social role of commercially oriented media, by which I mean news organizations that exist to make a profit, and even those that do not but seek advertising revenue, is to advance ruling class interests. The Western media is managed by the Western ruling class and tells stories that steer the public towards attitudes favorable to that ruling class. If there is a dominant narrative about a particular story or group, that narrative is likely informed by power relations. Who has it? Who does not have it? Who wants to keep the status quo? Such dominant narratives include perspectives on Palestine-Israel amenable to a situation wherein the U.S. ensures that Israel remains the dominant military power in the region because that benefits U.S. political and economic objectives. So something very important to understand is that legacy news outlets as a whole exist not to inform their audience necessarily, but to manipulate their audience in a way that's amenable to them. Of course, there's a certain skill and finesse involved here, right? It's rarely outright lies being reported, although that sometimes can be the case, but oftentimes it's much more subtle, like the deliberate choice of language and words to obfuscate the truth. And if I can make a general observation, there are many issues involving powerful people with huge economic and financial implications where the coverage will have been skewed one way or another depending on which narrative benefits said economic and financial interests. Now, the beauty of today's media ecosystem, and this is optimistic James speaking, is that unlike in the past where there was limited distribution and really tight control of who gets to say something and what they can say, nowadays with the proliferation of independent media and social media, the truth is out there somewhere. We've just got to find it and amplify it as much as possible. Speaking to this issue specifically, changes in the media landscape have eroded the power of a few outlets to determine what information and perspectives Americans received. The expansion of Middle East-based English language media outlets has allowed for more perspectives. Social media has also played a major role, allowing Palestinians and human rights organizations to circumvent traditional media and government censors and provide images, videos, and voices of what the Palestinians are truly experiencing on the ground. Technology has allowed Palestinians to send images and their own stories out into a world that once lacked access to places like Gaza or choose to ignore or disbelieve Palestinians. So change is possible, and that's partly why I do what I do. You know, you can see in the public opinion data the shifting views about Israel and Palestine as previously suppressed viewpoints are now more readily accessible. Of course, the fight against legacy media is a daunting one, and truth be told, the independent media ecosystem isn't void of bad faith actors either. So that's the challenge. And maybe instead of the common adage of a few bad apples, the entire media landscape is more like an orchard of rotten apples with a few good eggs. Terrible analogy, but you get my point. Those are my thoughts for this week. Thank you for listening. It's definitely a challenge week in and week out to sift through this minefield of information. So I appreciate you for spending a few minutes of your time every week with me as we continue to search for what we believe is the truth. Let me know what your thoughts and comments are in the comment section below. What other topics would you like for me to explore? If you enjoyed this video and want to support my work, please click on that like button, share this video, and consider subscribing and clicking on that notification bell icon so you can be the first to watch each week. And as always, thank you so much for your time. I'll see you next week.